Picture this. It's the morning of January 22, 1946. You are standing in the Chuarkura Square, which is the Square of the Four Lamps in the small city of Mahabad, Iran.
Right.
And stepping up to a wooden podium is a man named Qazi Mohammed. And his outfit, I mean, it just tells you everything you need to know about the incredible paradox of this moment.
Yeah, the outfit is so striking.
He's wearing a crisp Russian military uniform, but on his head rests the traditional religious turban of an Islamic judge. He looks out at a crowd of his people ready to declare something that will basically ripple through history.
It is a striking image. I mean, it's a single moment where ancient traditions, local aspirations, and the massive grinding gears of global geopolitics just all intersect right in that square.
Exactly. And that is our mission for this deep dive. Today, we are exploring the fascinating, incredibly complex, and, well, very short-lived Mahabad Kurdish Republic of 1946.
Right, because we are looking at a deeply turbulent landscape today. You've got Kurds, Azeris, Russians, British, and Persians all clashing.
Yeah, it's a lot. And I want to be clear right up front, our mission here isn't to litigate who was right or wrong in these historical conflicts or take any sides. We are just impartially reporting the events from our sources to pull back the curtain on the actual mechanics of how this localized power vacuum was exploited to build a temporary republic.
Exactly. We're diving into the machinery of state building in a war zone, examining how ancient tribal loyalties and the shifting strategies of great world powers collided to create this really unique moment.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because you really can't understand the Mahabad Republic of 1946 without first understanding the people who built it and, how they define themselves. So where does the Kurdish identity actually begin?
Well, historians have struggled for a long time to pinpoint exact origins, to be honest. If you look at the historical record, the Greek historian Xenophon, around 400 BC, he wrote about the Karduks.
A Karduk.
And they were fierce mountain fighters who harassed his retreating army. And many trace the ancestry back to the ancient Medes, which was an empire from the 7th century BC.
Right.
But beyond the history books, there's this really powerful mythological origin story that shapes the cultural psyche.
Oh, the myth of Zahak.
Yeah.
Yeah, this blew my mind when I was reviewing the background material.
It's so vivid. It's recorded in a 16th century text called the Sheriff Name. According to this Persian myth, there was a tyrant named Zahak. And Zahak had a horrifying affliction, basically.
Right? The snake heads.
Exactly. 2 snake heads growing right out of his shoulders. And to keep these snakes calm, they demanded a gruesome daily diet, which was the brains of 2 young people.
It's so dark. Every single day, 2 youths were sacrificed.
Every day. But eventually, a clever deception was devised to save at least some of the youth. Instead of 2 human brains, the brain of a sheep was secretly substituted for one of them.
Wow.
Right, so this allowed 1 young person each day to escape the tyrant's grasp. And these surviving youths, they fled into the harsh, remote mountains where Zahak's forces just couldn't reach them.
Because the terrain was just too difficult.
Exactly. Over time, they multiplied and formed their own society. And according to the myth, these mountain refugees became the Kurdish people.
I mean, think about that. That is essentially a superhero origin story.
It really is.
It's a foundation myth built entirely on surviving tyranny. If you have a shared cultural story of escaping oppression and finding sanctuary in the mountains, that creates an incredibly potent glue for a national identity.
What's fascinating here is that whether you trace their roots to the ancient Medes or to this vivid mythology of Zahak, the core of the identity is inextricably tied to the geography of those mountains.
The mountains were everything.
Yeah, they were a harsh, unforgiving environment, but they were a protective fortress. That geography shaped the culture and the language, too. Kurdish developed as its own distinct Indo-European language, completely separate from Persian in its grammar and vocabulary.
And even within that mountain culture, there was a deep divide. There was a strict cultural line passing right near Mahabad that separated the northern and southern tribes. And it wasn't just geographical, it was visible right down to the clothes they wore.
Yes, south of this line, the traditional trousers were wide at the waist and narrowed down tight at the ankles.
Correct.
But north of that line, the trousers were tight at the waist and flared out wide at the bottom, almost like bell bottoms.
That's such a specific detail.
It sounds small, I know, but it's a visual marker of the deep, localized tribal identities. Before any concept of a modern unified nation-state, your primary loyalty was to your local tribe, signaled by something as basic as the cut of your clothing.
Right. But those mountains, while providing a fortress, They also placed them directly on a geopolitical fault line. They were living right where massive empires collided.
Let's look at the wedge of those empires. In 1639, the Treaty of Qazi officially split the region right down the middle.
Right, between the Sunni Ottoman Empire to the west and the Shiite Persian Empire to the east.
Exactly. And from that moment, the strategy for survival often meant pitting one empire against the other.
It's like a perpetual bidding war. The tribes weren't just passive subjects. They operated almost like free agents in a deadly bidding war, constantly selling their loyalty to whichever empire, Ottoman or Persian, offered them the most autonomy that week.
That is a highly accurate way to look at it. And that bidding war completely exploded into chaos during World War I. Russian troops invaded northern Iran, pushing out the Ottomans.
Okay.
Then the Russian Empire collapsed from its own revolution, leaving this massive power vacuum. The region turned into a brutal landscape of inter-ethnic violence as different groups just scrambled for survival and territory.
And that scramble created intense friction. For example, the Christian Assyrian tribes who were fleeing Ottoman forces pushed into the area around Urmia,
Yes.
and they were armed with weapons left behind by the retreating Russians. This led to a devastating collision with the local Muslim Kurdish tribes.
Which brings us to a defining tragic event of this period. The Kurdish tribal leader, Simiko, invited the Assyrian spiritual and national leader, Patriarch Marsheman, to a peace dinner to ostensibly discuss an alliance.
A peace...
Right. But at the dinner, Simiko's men suddenly opened fire, assassinating the patriarch and almost his entire entourage.
Wow. And the sources say there were rumors Simiko was bribed by the Ottoman government to carry out the assassination.
Whatever the motivation, it sparked a devastating cycle of revenge and violence. The Assyrian forces were ultimately shattered and forced into a disastrous retreat.
It's just brutal.
It highlights the brutal reality of the era. Political maneuvering was often conducted through direct, severe violence.
But amidst all this chaos, the 1920 Treaty of Sèvres, which was signed right after WWI, actually promised a blueprint for an autonomous Kurdish state.
It did, on paper.
The Allies drew it up, yet it never happened. Why did a signed treaty just vanish into thin air?
Because a paper treaty means nothing if you can't enforce it on the ground. The Allies carved up the map in Paris, but back in the region, Mustafa Kemal, who would become known as Ataturk, was mobilizing a fierce nationalist army.
So he just rejected it.
He didn't accept the treaty at all. He militarily pushed back the Allied forces and established the borders of modern Turkey through sheer force of arms.
Right.
Kemal's military victories physically overwrote the lines drawn at Sèvres, rendering the treaty completely obsolete before the ink was barely dry.
It just shows you couldn't build a modern state while the great empires still held the reins. And you certainly couldn't build one using only feudal tribal warfare.
Exactly.
But then, in August 1941, the gears of World War II unexpectedly snapped those reins completely.
Correct. In August 1941, Soviet and British forces invaded Iran to secure supply lines against Nazi Germany. They deposed the Iranian ruler, Reza Shah.
And they split the country.
The Soviets took control of the north of Iran, the British took the south. But right in the middle, around Mahabad, they left this fragile, somewhat ambiguous neutral zone.
And the Soviets realized quickly that to protect their supply lines running through the north, they needed the local tribes to be cooperative. So they go on a massive charm offensive.
They really do.
In 1941, the Soviets invited 30 tribal leaders to Baku, the capital of Soviet Azerbaijan. They handed out gifts, saddles, fine fabric, and notably a pistol for the 8-year-old son of Qazi Mohammed.
They were actively cultivating influence. But while the Soviets were courting the leaders, the central Iranian government's authority in Mahabad was rotting from the inside.
Right.
And it completely collapsed in May 1943 over something incredibly mundane.
Here's where it gets really interesting, because it wasn't some grand military battle that expelled the Iranian Empire from Mahabad. It was a dispute over a sugar ration list.
The sugar riot. It's such a bizarre catalyst.
Seriously.
The Iranian government discovered a massive corruption scheme. Phantom villages, places that literally didn't exist, were listed on the local sugar ration distribution list. Local elites were likely hoarding the extra sugar to sell on the black market.
So the government steps in.
Yeah, the government tasked the local police station in Mahabad with enforcing a new, strictly controlled ration list.
And the locals benefiting from the phantom rations were furious. A crowd gathers in the square. A man is giving a rousing emotional speech about Kurdish culture and identity.
Right, tensions are high.
And while the crowd is fired up, agitators manipulate the situation. They point the angry crowd toward the police station, urging them to destroy the new ration list. The crowd attacks. 7 Iranian policemen are killed in the chaos. The surviving police flee the city.
It shows you that imperial power isn't always overthrown by a grand, organized army. Sometimes, an empire's authority is so stretched and its bureaucracy so compromised that a localized riot over a basic commodity like sugar is enough to completely snap the tether.
But wait, why didn't the Iranian government just send the army back in the next day to crush the riot and retake the police station?
Because they physically couldn't? The Soviets controlled the roads in the broader region. They restricted the movements of the Iranian military.
Oh, wow.
The Iranian Empire didn't just fall in Mahabad, it was locked out.
Yeah.
The Iranians couldn't send reinforcements because the Soviets wouldn't let them through.
So overnight, the police are gone. The army is locked out. A complete power vacuum. And if someone doesn't step up, the surrounding tribes are going to sweep in and loot the city.
Order had to be maintained. This vacuum naturally elevated the most respected local figures to take charge, and the most respected figure was Qazi Mohammed.
Qazi Mohammed was from a highly esteemed family of religious judges. He was a qazi, a judge who applied Islamic law.
Yes.
He was well-read, spoke several foreign languages, and possessed this immense commanding presence. He was essentially the only man in Mahabad who had the sheer moral authority to look at unruly tribes, like the Mashish and the Mingur, and tell them to stand down and not raid the city.
He steps up to keep the peace, managing the day-to-day administration. But a judge keeping the peace isn't a political party.
Right.
The political brain of this future republic was forming in the shadows. Enter Komal.
The Kurdistan Resurrection Society. Founded secretly in September 1942 in an orchard outside the city by just 15 middle-class citizens. We're talking shopkeepers, teachers, civil servants, not tribal warlords.
They were inspired by a similar earlier group in Iraqi Kurdistan called Heavy. But because the environment was so volatile, Komal adopted incredibly strict clandestine methods. They operated in a cell structure.
Explain how that actually works in practice, because it sounds like a spy thriller.
It really does. In a cell structure, the organization is heavily compartmentalized. A member only knows the 5 or 6 people in their specific cell.
Okay.
They don't know the identities of the broader membership or the top leadership. The mechanics of this are purely for survival. If a member is captured and interrogated, they can only ever betray the handful of people in their own cell. It protects the entire network from collapsing.
And to even join a cell, you had to swear a blood oath on the Quran in front of 3 witnesses, promising to never betray the cause.
Serious business.
They even had a secret password, which translates to "worshiping God is a good thing." But it was a brilliant piece of tradecraft because it had a double meaning.
Right, the location.
The hill where they first met was called Exuidaparist. So saying being part of Exuidaparist is a good thing signaled your membership without alerting outsiders.
The tradecraft was excellent. But by October 1944, Komal faced a severe crisis of growth. They had a robust secret organization, but they were mostly middle-class citizens.
You didn't have the clout.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Lacked the public gravity, and traditional authority needed to truly unite the fiercely independent tribes and the wider city. They realized they desperately needed Qazi Mohammed.
But they were terrified of him.
They were.
They were a democratic, middle-class, secret society. They feared that if they invited this aristocratic, immensely powerful religious judge into their ranks, his sheer authority would completely steamroll their democratic structure. It's like a grassroots tech startup realizing they need a massive, aggressive celebrity CEO to survive, even knowing that CEO might take over the whole company.
It's like a startup, sure, but with life or death stakes. If the CEO decided to turn on them, or if the union failed, they wouldn't just lose their company, they could be imprisoned or executed.
Yeah, that's a good point.
That's why those blood oaths and the cell structures were so critical. But despite their fears, they secretly invited him to a meeting.
And to their surprise, Qazi Mohammed accepts without hesitation. And just as they feared, but also exactly as they needed, he quickly becomes the de facto frontman and leader of the entire movement.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, this was the pivotal moment. This marriage between traditional aristocratic religious authority and a modern middle-class political cell was the essential required step to build a viable republic.
You needed both.
Right. The tribes wouldn't respect a secret society of shopkeepers, and the international community wouldn't recognize a lone religious judge. But together, they formed a complete, functional political vehicle.
So they have the organization
Yeah.
and they have the leader. Now, they need to capture the hearts of the public. You can't just declare a state. You have to make the people believe in it.
And they achieved this cultural awakening through art. In early 1945, Kommel staged a play, an opera essentially, called De Kinushteman, or Motherland.
The audience's reaction was intensely visceral. The motherland was depicted on stage as a woman in chains, physically abused by her captors, until her valiant children rise up to break her chains and rescue her.
Very powerful imagery.
If you were standing in the crowd watching that opera, you weren't just seeing a play, you were seeing your entire identity, your struggles, and your hopes validated on stage for the very first time. People were openly weeping in the audience.
It totally galvanized the public. And they didn't just use high art, they ingeniously repurposed everyday local traditions. There was an old folk game called Mir, where a villager would dress up as a prince.
Oh, right, the comedy game.
Yeah, traditionally people would try to make him laugh, and if he broke character and laughed, he was playfully beaten with sticks.
But Kommel hijacked the game.
Exactly. Under Kommel's influence, the prince stopped playing for laughs. He used the traditional authority of the game to issue real, binding orders for citizens to perform nationalist duties, mediate disputes, or collect donations for the cause.
That is so smart.
It was a brilliant mechanism for grassroots mobilization, blending practical administration seamlessly with ancient tradition.
Okay, the culture is primed, the organization is solid, the Iranian government is locked out. But to actually declare a state in 1945, you need the backing of a superpower. You need weapons, which leads to the second Baku trip in September 1945. Qazi Mohammed and a delegation travel back to Soviet Azerbaijan.
This time, they aren't there for saddles and gifts. They're there for a geopolitical showdown. They secure a meeting with Jafar Bajarov, the highly powerful prime minister of Soviet Azerbaijan.
And Bajarov tries to assert control. He tells Qazi Mohammed that his people can have autonomy, but it must be strictly under the umbrella of Soviet Azerbaijan.
And this is where Qazi Mohammed demonstrates his political steel. He defiantly refuses the prime minister.
He just says no.
Yeah. He demands full separate independence. He won't settle for being a sub-province of Azerbaijan.
And amazingly, Bajarov backs down. He agrees to support them, promising tanks, weapons, and crucially, a printing press to mass-produce literature. But why? Why would a powerful Soviet leader yield to a local judge?
Because Bajarov realized Qazi Mohammed was simply too influential to replace. The Soviets needed a stable buffer zone in northern Iran, much more than they needed total, absolute obedience.
Okay.
Bajarov begrudgingly accepted a marriage of convenience. He gave up direct control in exchange for regional stability, knowing that Qazi Mohammed was the only man who could keep the area from devolving back into chaos.
But Bajarov does give them a strict warning before they leave. He tells Qazi Mohammed not to trust a man named Mullah Mustafa Barzani.
Yes. Barzani was a fierce, legendary warrior from across the border who was, at that very moment, crossing into Iran with thousands of his heavily armed followers after a failed uprising in Iraq.
And Bajarov didn't like him.
Bajarov explicitly labeled Barzani a British agent.
So what does this all mean? The Soviets are arming a republic they can't fully control, while warning them about British agents in their own ranks.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, the Soviets were playing a massive game of proxy chess. They wanted a point of leverage against the pro-Western Iranian government in Tehran, and by extension, the British and Americans.
Right.
For the Soviets, empowering Qazi Mohammed, even if he was stubbornly independent, was a highly useful strategic tool to keep the region destabilized and out of Western control. It was a calculated risk.
It is an incredible sequence of events. We've traced this journey from the ancient myth of Zahak's snakeheads through the absolute chaos of imperial bidding wars. We saw how an empire-stretched bureaucracy snapped over a localized sugar riot, locking them out of their own city.
Yeah, the sugar riot still amazes me.
We saw middle-class citizens swearing blood oaths in a secret orchard.
And finally, we saw a traditional religious judge leveraging his regional influence to force a Soviet prime minister into supplying the weapons and the printing press needed to birth a new republic.
It shows that history is never just dry dates and treaties signed in faraway capitals. It is made of these intensely human moments. It's an entire theater audience weeping at a local opera. It's a judge deciding to risk his life to join a secret society to prevent his city from burning.
But analyzing these mechanics also leaves us with a profound, unresolved tension. The Mahabad Republic was built on a fundamental paradox.
Go so.
Well, to achieve the organization and the firepower necessary for independence, the leaders had to rely on the weapons, the political umbrella, and the strategic tolerance of an external superpower, which was the Soviets.
Right.
This raises an important question for you to ponder. Can a stateless nation ever truly achieve self-determination? if the very mechanics of its birth rely entirely on the strategic whims of an occupying empire? Because the lingering threat is obvious. What happens to that independence the moment the empire's strategic interests shift?
That is the exact tension Qazi Mohammed carried with him as he stepped up to that podium on January 22, 1946. Standing in the Square of the Four Lamps, wearing the uniform of a foreign empire but the turban of his own people, trying to thread an impossible needle. Thank you for taking this deep dive into the source material with us. We'll catch you next time.